Police are called to a hostel in Wales to investigate an horrific crime. After a night out in town, the killer and his female victim return to his room. There, he repeatedly stabs her. Aged 34, Matthew Williams has over 70 offences against his name, ranging from burglary and violent crime to domestic abuse. Only 2 weeks before the killing, Williams was released from prison with no follow-up supervision.
Williams has a long history of drug abuse, violence, and mental health issues. Is this a murder that could have been avoided? One in 5 murders in the UK is now committed by an ex-prisoner.
From serial rapists
he harboured dark thoughts about carrying out sexual offences
to convicted killers,
they'd met in prison, they were out on the streets together.
free to walk amongst us,
They knew he could have killed again.
free to murder innocent people.
She stabbed him many times, and then she hid him in a wheelie bin.
I'm Donald McIntyre, and I'm examining how such tragedies happen. Who's to blame? Is it the justice system?
Or are these killers just pure evil?
She gained pleasure from hurting people.
And ultimately, could an innocent life have been saved? This is Released to Kill. Matthew Williams was born in Newport, Wales in 1979 to parents Chris and Sally. He was the eldest of 4 brothers and seemed like a perfectly normal child.
Up until the age of about 10, Matthew done very well in school. He was very clever in that respect. He enjoyed his sports. He was very good at swimming, but he was very good at drawing as well, artistic, you know.
When Matthew Williams is 10, Chris and his wife Sally separate and later divorce. Matthew and his 2 brothers stay with their mother and move to the small town of Blackwood, 11 miles away. Dad Chris remembers how Matthew was affected at the time.
I think Matthew became a little bit withdrawn, but of course, as adults, you don't really think of the kids. You know, they're the last thing on your mind because you've got bigger things going on, if you like, you know.
We are looking at somebody here who has moved location, and in doing so, he's lost his social group. He's probably lost his sense of self. He has to redesign himself, essentially, in a completely new place and in an unfamiliar environment, and without his father.
Matthew doesn't take the move and the family break up well. He starts to go downhill, misbehaving at school and hanging out with the wrong crowd. By the time he's 11, he's already smoking cannabis.
Some studies suggest a real link between early use of cannabis and going on to demonstrate mental illness or problematic behaviour. Cannabis can act as that sort of bridge from predisposition and vulnerability to actually experiencing mental illness.
For the rest of his life, Matthew will be chronically addicted to cannabis and Class A drugs like amphetamines.
Drug abuse from a young age has a devastating impact on the brain. It can make people very impulsive, unable to control their feelings and their thoughts, and can lead to psychotic illness in later life.
Unfortunately, no one stops Williams from taking drugs and hanging out with the wrong crowd. His behaviour worsens, and at only 13, he's expelled from school for fighting.
If you're dropping out of school, you lose your peer group. You begin to see yourself as somebody who can't fit in, who isn't worthy.
He returns to school, but leaves at just 15.
He's now free to roam the streets and spend time with whoever he wants. His drug use increases dramatically, and like any addict, he needs money to fund his habit.
Williams starts stealing to support his drug use.
The problem is with drugs is that people want to keep taking them, and they're expensive. and therefore many people don't have enough money to take them, and yet have this craving for the drug, and therefore do things that they wouldn't normally do in order to get the funding for those drugs.
In 1995, when Williams is still only 15, his parents persuade him to see the Gwent Drug Misuse Service. But while receiving treatment, he continues to take drugs and break into houses to pay for them. Finally, in October 1995, he's convicted of burglary and sentenced to 2 years in a Young Offenders Institute. His father hopes that a short, sharp shock will put him back on the straight and narrow.
First time, I thought that would frighten the life out of him and he'd turn his life around. But when Matthew came out, he just went back with the same people that he hung around with, and the cycle continued.
It seems that Williams is determined to carry on with his life of drugs and crime. The police national computer highlights him as a prolific offender. 41 offences lead to multiple sentences in Young Offenders Institutes.
They're challenging places like gladiator schools. Who's the toughest, who's the hardest, who can lift the most weight, who's the loudest. The sad thing is that the highest reoffending rate amongst former prisoners are the under 21s.
Williams' drug habit is driving his offending, but he never receives a court order compelling him to enter drug rehabilitation.
There is a huge gap between the number of people on probation who have a drugs problem, which we think may be as high as 75,000, and the number being referred for treatment by the probation service, which is less than 3,000. It's essential that that gap is closed. There are powers for the courts to use and for the probation service to use, but they're not being used widely enough. Information isn't being shared between prisons, probation and drug treatment services, and that means that people are still carrying on using drugs and committing offences.
Until now, Williams appears similar to many reckless young offenders, unwilling to stop his stealing and drug use. But on April 16, 1997, aged 17, he's arrested by police. And they're so concerned by his erratic behaviour that they refer him to mental health services.
He's admitted to an acute mental health unit, but his stay there is short. He immediately breaks the unit's drug-free policy and is discharged after less than 3 hours for using cannabis.
We're really used to seeing substance misuse in those with mental illness. And so really, we should be considering it as a symptom of that mental illness. And it's therefore incredibly short-sighted to reject somebody from a service for simply displaying a symptom of their mental illness.
60% of the people on drug rehabilitation requirements we looked at also had an underlying mental health condition, and that can be very difficult to manage. Quite often mental health services will refuse to treat someone who is actively addicted to drugs, people who are actively psychotic or suffering from severe mental illness. So the range of services for people who have both of those problems is quite limited and needs significant expansion.
At the request of his mother, Williams is readmitted to an acute mental health unit. But staff can find no evidence of psychiatric illness, and he's discharged the following morning.
So in terms of links between people who use drugs and mental illness, there's what I call confounding factors. So there are background factors like growing up in environments of abuse, whether that's physical, sexual, emotional, or growing up in environments where drug use is rife, poverty, deprivation. So all of those things can predispose to drug use, and separately, they can also predispose to mental illness.
Williams seems completely unwilling to stop taking drugs and committing crime. He's soon back in the Young Offenders Institute, and there's the first red flag for serious psychological problems.
A letter from probation services to Matthew's doctor reports that he's distressed, having erratic thoughts and hearing voices that are affecting his behaviour.
In 1999, when he's incarcerated in Cardiff prison for yet another offence, he again tells staff that he's hearing voices. It's recommended that on release he should see a community psychiatric nurse. Sadly, he never attends.
It keeps coming back to the same thing, that Matthew didn't trust any of them. So, yeah, he wouldn't accept help.
Professor Taj Nathan, a forensic psychiatrist, and Vanessa Frake, a retired prison governor, join me in the Crime Hub to discuss the case.
It's kind of very sad because, you know, you see him before the age of 11, like any other kid, it's all open there. And then there's reports that he's taking cannabis at an age as young as 11. And, I mean, there's always concerns about kids taking cannabis in their teens, but at age 11, it's hugely concerning.
Adolescence is a time when the brain is particularly vulnerable to the adverse effects of drugs, so that is of a major concern.
I mean, kids at that age, teenagers, adolescents, drugs, you know, family divorce. I mean, it's hard to separate the environmental issues with the kind of mental health issues.
Use of drugs, difficulties at home, getting involved in some criminal activity, or was this the start of something more significant? And at that stage, I don't think it was clear.
And I see that there was genuine support for him and consideration of his mental health issues when he was incarcerated in the juvenile detention centre. How likely would that have been a positive experience?
That's difficult to judge, but he will have had a very stable experience in the prison, whereas from what we know about Matthew, his life was quite chaotic outside the prison, with his parents separating, the drugs, the bad crowd that he'd got himself into.
And he returns to the community, and he returns, unfortunately, to, you know, kind of emotional chaos, a landscape that's topsy-turvy in relation to his domestic circumstances.
He reverted back to his cycle of drugs and violence and bad crowds.
Matthew Williams is a young man with mental health issues and a chronic drug habit. He steals in order to fund his lifestyle. How can he break this vicious cycle?
Since the age of 11, Matthew Williams has been taking drugs, regularly turning to crime to fund his addictions.
By the time he turned 18, Williams had served custodial sentences for 41 different crimes, most of those related to drugs and violence.
In 2002, when Williams is 22, there's a sign that things might be settling down. He meets a partner, Emma, and starts a long-term relationship.
Was good as far as I know. Again, you know, Emma could be a bit of a loose cannon. You know, they'd fallen out and then they'd be back together. You know, like a lot of relationships today, that goes on.
At 22, Williams is at a crucial age in terms of his mental health.
It's very easy within the literature to see two streams of people, what we call adolescent limited versus lifetime antisocial. For some people, there is a kind of peak in antisocial behaviour, particularly for boys, between about 14 and 18, 19. And then they return to being much nicer citizens by their early 20s. And only a few go on to have that lifetime type of antisocial behaviour. And really one of the skills when you're assessing people at that younger age is to try and know which type of fish you've got there.
Unfortunately, being in a relationship doesn't cure Williams' problems.
As his former partner explained to me, he could suddenly turn and, you know, one could almost say it was a sort of Jekyll and Hyde situation. That was clearly precipitated by his mental health problems. So I would imagine that the mental health problems grew as he got older, but probably had their roots in his childhood, but then were greatly exacerbated by his drug taking.
2 years later, in 2004, his partner Emma persuades him to attend a mental health inpatient unit. When interviewed, she reports that Matthew believes he has green creatures crawling all over his body and hands. He's admitted voluntarily, but keeps running off from the ward, buying drugs and returning in a distressed state. Psychiatrists are so concerned by his behaviour and his unwillingness to stick with the treatment that he's finally detained under the Mental Health Act.
The Mental Health Act is a framework to decide whether people need to be sectioned. So that means if they meet specific medico-legal criteria, and if they're ill enough so that they're a risk to themselves or to other people, then they will be detained against their will. So the Mental Health Act, and specifically detaining somebody, is always used as a last resort.
Once sectioned, Williams has to comply with the doctors. Compulsory medication and psychiatric care finally seem to work, and he calms down. 5 weeks after admission, he's released to live with Emma. At first, all seems well, but away from hospital care, he's soon back to his old ways. He stops taking his medication and turns to drugs and alcohol. He reverts to a life of crime, but now he's not just stealing, he's becoming more violent and dangerous to others.
So he was trying to do whatever he could to get money so he could buy drugs. Having said all that, the other types of offences that are related to violence, intimidation, assault, I think that speaks more to his actual personality. I think that suggests that he's an antisocial person. I think he thrives off the reputation of being an intimidating individual.
It comes to a climax on the 6th of September 2004. Williams is remanded to Cardiff Prison for burglary, theft, and wounding with intent to cause grievous bodily harm. He'll be locked away for the next 4 years. Williams wants to get out of prison as soon as possible. The only way that that's going to happen is if he cooperates with rehab and treatment. So with freedom in mind, he accepts psychiatric support and the medication he needs. 4 years later, on the 20th of August 2008, Williams is released. His partner Emma has stuck by him. He moves back in with her and they quickly conceive a son.
Emma had 2 children from a previous relationship, 2 girls. But when Matthew had his son, that was his world.
Matthew has a turbulent history of crime, drug, and mental health issues. Now, at the age of 25, he's a father. Could this mean he's about to change his ways?
There is some hope that fatherhood might transform him.
Yes, and I think he also had that hope. So he believed that the focus of having a child may lead him to leave his past behind him. It didn't turn out to be the case.
Working with offenders, young and old, do you think the impending fatherhood often is that road to Damascus moment where people can change their lives?
Definitely it can change their lives, and unfortunately it also has the opposite effect. It has no impact whatsoever. And I mean, the first step clearly would be for him to want to change his life around, and it would seem and appear that initially he did want to do that.
And so is this the kind of language he would be speaking to probation, or do you think he was telling the truth about his efforts to seek a new path, change his life?
I think he's probably telling the truth. The difficulty is, though, that he is likely to have difficulty delaying gratification for other things, so such as drugs and getting involved in antisocial behaviour. So whilst on the one hand he may be holding out hope that there is some future for him as a father, on the other hand he's faced with his immediate temptations, and I think he finds it difficult to resist those temptations.
Sadly, the positive effect of fatherhood doesn't last long. William's relationship with his partner Emma deteriorates. She reports that he's violent to her and one of her young daughters.
There didn't seem to be any particular cause for his anger. He would just suddenly flip and his mood would change, and I'm sure it was extremely disturbing.
His partner Emma asks Williams to leave. Away from the calming influence of Emma and his son, he swiftly returns to crime.
We often see that with people who are addicted to drugs, they go through a cycle of offences. So they socialise with other peers that commit these kind of crimes, which makes it much more easier for it to be acceptable amongst their community. On top of all of those things, as time passes, especially if they get more heavily addicted to drugs and if they spent more and more time developing a much bigger criminal record, it's much harder to find legitimate employment in the future. So they are marginalised even more from society and they're pushed more to the fringes of the criminal underworld.
In February 2013, he's convicted of blackmail after breaking into a friend's house with a garden fork and threatening him. He's sentenced to 27 months to be served in Cardiff and Glamorgan's Park prisons.
He'd actually been involved in blackmailing a friend in relation to an allegation that he'd stolen his mobile phone. It sounds quite a trivial thing, but I think it's probably a manifestation of the violent nature of the man that it was regarded as sufficiently serious to jail him.
Just 7 months later, on the 10th of September 2013, Williams is released on parole. Almost immediately, he breaches his license conditions by getting drunk, taking drugs, breaking his curfew, and after just 2 weeks, he's back in prison.
Some people have what we call in forensic psychiatry antisocial personality disorder, a lack of caring about the law or right or wrong, being impulsive, being aggressive, being quite selfish. So I think people that have those personality traits are extremely difficult to treat. There's almost nothing that you can do aside from punishing them and imprisoning them when they commit offences.
Over the next few months, Williams is released unlicensed twice more, but each time is rearrested on burglary offences. He's returned to prison. With little prospect of him being released unlicensed again, he refuses to cooperate with the authorities.
Williams has been on and off medication for years to treat his psychosis and paranoia. But despite it being prescribed, he now refuses to take it. His excuse to the psychiatric team is that his mental health has settled. Meanwhile, he's taking Subutex, a heroin substitute widely available in prisons. He refuses to participate in drug rehabilitation courses.
That involves things like group psychological therapy as well as one-to-one sessions. And it's really about the prisoner reflecting on the aspects of their lives that have led them to addiction and drug use in the first place.
Williams' behaviour becomes increasingly worrying. He sends letters to his ex-partner Emma containing threats to attack and kill police officers.
When I was shown the letters that he'd written from prison in which he was issuing threats to his former partner and also to named police officers, I thought, well, this really does show the disturbing nature of Matthew Williams's mindset.
If I was an outside police officer and I know somebody had made threats to me, I would expect the system to protect me. And if somebody is making those sorts of threats, then clearly they're not fit to be released.
He's also creating disturbing drawings and poems.
You know, when you got skulls and he's not right, is he? You know, he drew this. There's one of the drawings. God forgive me for my sins and the ones I'm about to do.
I think these things really indicate this is somebody who is very disturbed, very dangerous.
Despite the drawings, threatening letters, and his refusal to take part in drug rehab, his mental health records report that Williams is starting to improve. His prison psychiatrist takes him off medication.
His mental health may be improving, but his behaviour isn't. He simply refuses to cooperate with the regime. He even tells prison staff he likes his reputation as a bad man.
Astonishingly, he's yet again put up for parole and early release. But Williams isn't interested because his release date is coming up anyway.
Matthew decided to serve his full sentence so that when he came out, He didn't have to abide by a curfew.
At the end of his sentence, prison services conduct a risk assessment. He's classified as medium risk.
A medium risk is one where we perhaps need to monitor the situation and act if things become worse. And I think the issue there was clearly that he was going back into an environment where he would take drugs immediately, and therefore his mental health would deteriorate to its worst.
Matthew Williams walks out of prison on October 23, 2014. Because he served his full sentence, legally he's a free man and no supervision is required to be put in place. He refuses support from probation and even turns down a lift from police to his accommodation.
He is now not on the medication which in the past has helped control his psychotic behaviour, nor is he referred to the local mental health team, which was not involved in the prescribing decision.
His release report states, a psychiatrist did not feel medication needed to be prescribed at this time.
If you were ever going to paint a prognosis for future criminality and dysfunctionality, then he was presenting perhaps, you know, on the most acute end, in particularly the way he left the prison without any support.
Yeah, so I think one could say with confidence there was a very high likelihood that he would reoffend and that he would continue to engage in the sort of offending that he had shown before.
Here you are, you're witnessing a young man who is leaving jail and he's been through the system in and out, and you just know he's coming right back, and you're hoping he's going to come back for a crime which isn't too serious.
I think the writing was on the wall. He had 41 different offences, several custodial sentences by the time he was 18. The guy was a ticking time bomb.
Clearly there's a long record of kind of violence. The extent of the violence is not yet entirely apparent, but there's been some manipulative behaviour with the blackmail. This is a really very complex case for a psychiatrist to work with.
It is. So and one of the complex factors is that he's using drugs, and whatever mental health problems he has, it appears that drugs are making those worse. My reading of the case is that it was interpreted that his symptoms were drug-induced. I think that probably is an oversimplification, but certainly drugs didn't help his mental health problems.
Since the age of 16, Williams has spent more time in prison than out. In October 2014, at 35 years of age, Williams is released from prison once again, back to his old stomping ground.
Whoever you are, when you get released, you get a discharge grant. A discharge grant is going to last you until you get a check or whatever it is you get from the benefits people. That's enough to get drunk. It's enough to get high. If you find it too stressful to monitor yourself, to make that money last, you know, it's a real danger zone.
William's immediate problem is finding somewhere to live. He tries to find accommodation near his father in Newport, away from the temptations of his old haunts, but the council turn him down because he can't prove an established link to the area. Caerphilly Council find him emergency accommodation, but it's back in the very community where he's committed his previous crimes and where all his old friends live.
Matthew ended up living at the Cerys Arms in Argoed.
The Cerys Arms provided accommodation to homeless and vulnerable people, many like Williams, with criminal records. The owner would later reveal that she was told nothing about his criminal history.
He'd been there numerous times in the Cerys Arms, so he was used to it. He knew basically that the same people were in there all the time anyway. So it was nothing new to him then. It's back to the norm for him.
Because Williams has served his full prison sentence, he's legally under no supervision from probation and doesn't want it. No one is monitoring his behaviour.
Essentially, he was left to do what he wanted because nobody had the power to force him to do things.
On a visit to his GP, he's asked about his mental health. Williams lies, saying he has an appointment the next week with the local mental health team.
I think I would say that there are some people who have such antisocial tendencies and are so reluctant and unwilling to engage in the help they're offered that we're actually limited in being able to control them. We can only deal with the psychiatric issues. We can't force them to change their outlooks or their behaviours.
Given his freedom, it's no surprise that Matthew returns to his previous chaotic lifestyle.
How foreboding must it be for a young man to be released back into the community, literally with no support, albeit entirely of his own construction?
I think for him, yes, it would have been very daunting. And of course, he won't have had much money in his pocket. And we know he's unpredictable, that he is prone to outbursts of violence. So I think, all in all, it must have been a very scary place.
So he's in a hostel, he's out there of his own volition, but he appears to be reasonably stable.
Yes, at this stage, yeah.
And so at that stage, he's presenting a kind of more positive outcome than one might have expected.
In that initial phase, yes, he's... I think there was some suggestion that he was using drugs, and when he first turned up at the hospital, there were some concerns about how he was presenting. Was he intoxicated? He was asked to go away, but he returned and he was accepted, and I think they tolerated his behaviour. So there are no immediate early warning signs at this stage.
So effectively, as with many of these offenders, often in homeless hostels, there were issues, but none of them chronic. And these were very experienced kind of hostel owners and managers.
It was a small hostel, but they had managed ex-offenders and people who struggled to get, more stable accommodation. But they would have had a lot of experience of liaison with professionals and different authorities in the event of significant concerns, and they didn't feel that there were any signs of concern.
So far, so good. No signs and no real risk of a catastrophic outcome in the short term.
At the moment.
Shortly after moving into the Sahawi Arms, Matthew Williams goes on a night out with friends. He meets a young woman and they begin to spend time together.
There's nothing negative to say about her. I mean, she was an ordinary young woman, just was extremely unfortunate to have come across this extremely violent and dangerous individual.
A few days later, on the 5th of November 2014, Williams and the woman spend the day at a friend's house drinking lager and smoking cannabis. At around midnight, they both go back to his hostel, the Sahawi Arms.
Matthew should have known better, because they weren't allowed to bring anybody back to the Sahawi Arms, especially female company.
It then seems that some argument ensued between them, and the next thing people knew was that there were loud screams coming from the room.
Before long, the owner of the hostel arrives. She opens the door to see what she described as a scene from a horror film.
Police emergency.
She reports that on opening the door, she saw a woman's bloodied body on the floor and a man still attacking her. She identifies the assailant as Matthew Williams. The police check Williams' records and realise they're dealing with a dangerous offender.
They knew it was Matthew. They obviously knew Matthew's capabilities, his strength, his potential violent behaviour towards the police.
It's the early hours of the morning, so the local police station is closed. It takes 10 minutes for the police to arrive.
When they enter the room, they find the young woman dead, and Williams extremely violent towards them. The police initially are unable to restrain him.
Williams has taken a large amount of amphetamines, one of the side effects of which is extreme aggression. He refuses to surrender to police, so they have to repeatedly taser him.
They used the taser, in fact, 4 times on him before they disabled him.
The one barb goes on Matthew's bridge of his nose, between his eyes, the other one's in his chest. So he's got 50,000 volts to his head, to his chest, for about 5 seconds, I think.
Because of the large amount of drugs in his system, his heart stops, and he's pronounced dead at the scene.
I mean, it's beyond contemplation, the escalation here. I mean, what he produced in his hostel room was nothing short of a carnage.
Absolutely. It was absolutely like violence for violence's sake. I think there were so many injuries on the victim's body. It was certainly a dreadful scene. So he went literally from 0 to complete eruption.
I suspect it was the effect of the drugs on his mind. So we know from the history that here is someone who is vulnerable to the adverse mental effects of substances, of drugs, illegal drugs, and he had had psychotic experiences under the influence of drugs before, and I suspect that his escalation of drug use in this phase following his release from prison was the most significant contributor to his actions at this time.
In other cases you've come across, what's happening to the brain at this stage in an episode like this, in a chronic crisis, and what's potentially going through the mind of the offender?
He may not even understand what was going through his mind at the time, so it may have been so disordered that it might not have made sense to him. If, as I suspect, he was experiencing a psychotic episode, then there was some breakdown of reality, breakdown of his contact with reality.
I mean, you've come across inmates who've used amphetamines and they appear to nearly have superhuman strength at
Absolutely, yes, and are quite out of control. They have an almost like out-of-body experience, and it takes many staff to subdue a prisoner who is in that kind of a psychotic state, and also not only to prevent him harming others, but to prevent him harming himself.
And so now we have, tragically, 2 dead people. One inner demons in his head provoked by drug use. And of course, this entirely innocent and tragic victim who's in the wrong place at the wrong time.
It's an awful sequence of events that I don't think would have been possible to predict, and with an awful outcome.
Matthew Williams is released from prison and within 2 weeks has viciously attacked and murdered a young woman. He pays for this last attack with his own life.
Police don't immediately inform Williams' parents of their son's death, but news of the shocking incident travels fast around the small community.
I saw it on the TV that Matthew was dead because of the incident, and Sally was tapped on the shoulder taking the grandchildren to school by a friend who said, "Had you heard about the incident that Matthew had killed a girl and Matthew was dead?"
Could anything have been done to avert this tragedy?
Now, more than 4.5 years after the 2 deaths, Williams' father, Chris Williams, and the killer's ex-partner have released drawings and letters produced by him during the period leading up to his release that raised serious concerns about the decision to give him back his liberty.
In hindsight, the drawings done by Williams in prison take on a greater significance.
If he was drawing such violent pictures, this should really be reported to the team that's trying to look after him in terms of his mental health, so his responsible clinician and the team, so that they could assess and talk to the person about these, why they were doing this, and what the thoughts in their head were.
All letters leaving prison are read by security staff. Williams sent letters to a police officer threatening to kill him.
Sending threatening letters is a violent act in itself, and he could have been charged and kept further in a secure unit.
Were there enough warning signs to mark out Williams as a potential killer? Or was the final tragedy something that could never have been predicted?
Vanessa, you'd have dealt with many Matthew Williams in your time, people presenting with, you know, your standard alcohol, drugs, violence, burglary offences. Why did he become a murderer?
I think only Matthew Williams can answer that actual question. But in all fairness, with Matthew, we always knew that he was on the periphery. We always felt, going through the information that we've had, that he was bubbling, the drawings, the threats from, all seemed to be simmering gently.
I think it would be very difficult for someone to add those pictures together along with his criminal behaviour and even drug use and then say this is a murderer in waiting.
I would agree. So I think the pictures take on significance once the offence has occurred, but I think at the time the pictures were drawn, it would be very difficult, and in most cases probably the wrong thing to assume that they do indicate the likelihood that a homicide is going to occur.
Is there anywhere on this sad journey that an intervention could have helped prevent this terrible murder?
There's a question in my mind about whether, when he was in prison and presenting with mental health problems and being seen by the psychiatrists, whether he should have been considered for admission, transfer to a forensic psychiatric hospital. But even so, I'm not sure that would have changed the outcome in the long run.
I'm desperately struggling to find any shards of hope or even lessons to be learned out of this.
I firmly believe that nothing would have prevented this dreadful crime.
This was like a murderer hiding in our midst, and if there's any small comfort to be taken from this, this is an extremely rare crime.
Absolutely, extremely rare. Thankfully, and hopefully, you know, it doesn't happen again. And you know, all agencies, that's their goal, is to work towards the fact that something dreadful like this doesn't happen again.
A 2016 official inquiry reports that Williams was likely to be vulnerable outside prison because of drug misuse and a possible personality disorder resulting in psychotic episodes. It concluded that Williams had needed long-term psychiatric care and treatment. It was never received because he wouldn't cooperate or accept it.
The system may have failed Williams because he clearly didn't get the help he needed. But I'll be loath to criticise. This was a very difficult situation. A person who had refused help on nearly every situation where people had attempted. And also served all his sentence so that he didn't have to be under any restraint or orders. So there was very little people could actually do in the end to prevent this.
Before Williams' release, the probation service raised concerns, highlighting the fact that he had refused to engage in prison rehabilitation programs.
This case is quite difficult because I think arguably Williams could have had a higher level of support and supervision, but the problem is that he chose to go out and take illicit drugs. And as far as we can tell, that really affected his mental state. We know that in the past he's become psychotic when he took drugs. So I think on balance, it's very likely that this is what happened. And it's very hard for external services to prevent somebody from going out, buying illegal drugs and taking them.
Despite 55 custodial sentences and the mental health treatment Williams received, the final review of his case concludes. It is difficult to see how the incident of the 6th of November 2014 could have been either predicted or prevented by health services.
This is a case which begs the question, how can we break the cycle of reoffending if the perpetrator refuses to be helped? Should men like Williams be forced into drug rehabilitation and mental health treatment? If he had been supervised following his release from prison, could the life of an innocent young woman have been saved? Tragically, we'll never know.